The attack began at exactly 0600 Earth Standard Time on a Tuesday morning that would be remembered as the day humanity revealed its true face to the galaxy. Captain Alex Harrison stood on the bridge of the Nemesis as his ship dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kethvar home system. 11 other vessels appeared simultaneously around him, their black hulls almost invisible against the starfield as they moved toward targets that had no idea death was approaching. Kethvar Prime hung in space ahead of them like a blue-green jewel, home to 10 billion aliens who had spent their lives believing that their species was the dominant force in the galaxy. The planet's orbital defenses were impressive by most standards, but they had been designed to fight conventional enemies using traditional weapons. Nothing in Kethvar military doctrine had prepared them for what was about to happen. Alex gave the order that ended a civilization. The Nemesis fired a single Hellfire torpedo toward the planet below, while his sister ships targeted other major Dominion worlds throughout the star system. The weapons were so small and fast that enemy sensors barely detected them before they reached their targets and began the process that would turn solid worlds into expanding clouds of superheated gas. The first Hellfire device struck Kethvar, Prime's northern continent, and detonated deep within the planet's crust. The weapon created a cascade reaction that spread through the world's core in seconds, destabilizing the nuclear forces that held matter together. The planet's surface began to crack like an eggshell as tremendous energies tore through rock and metal that had been solid for billions of years. War Prime Thekshan was in his command center when the sensors detected unusual energy readings from the planet's core. He had less than 60 seconds to understand what was happening before the command bunker's reinforced walls began to glow with heat that no material could withstand. His last coherent thought was the realization that he had made a terrible mistake. In underestimating the species from Sol's system, Kethvar Prime died in 12 minutes. The planet's crust split apart like a broken egg, revealing a core that burned brighter than the system's sun, as atomic forces ran wild through matter that had been stable since the world's formation. 10 billion Kethvar died instantly as their home world came apart beneath them, reduced to elementary particles in the expanding plasma cloud that had once been the center of their empire. Across Kethvar space, the same scene played out on 43 worlds simultaneously. The Retribution fleet had divided into attack groups that struck every major population center and military base in Dominion territory. Industrial worlds that had built the ships and weapons used to attack human colonies became expanding spheres of molten metal. Agricultural planets that fed the Kethvar war machine turned into clouds of vaporized atmosphere and organic compounds. Jake Morrison felt the ground shake beneath New Seattle as resistance fighters emerged from hiding to strike at the Kethvar occupation forces. The aliens had received word of their homeworld's destruction through quantum communication networks, and their response was exactly what human planners had expected. Confused and demoralized by news of the catastrophe, the occupying troops made mistakes that the resistance was ready to exploit. The weapons that Earth's factories had secretly provided to the resistance cells were designed specifically to penetrate Kethvar armor and shields. Human fighters who had been hiding in tunnels and ruins suddenly possessed firepower that could destroy alien vehicles and kill enemy soldiers with surgical precision. The tide of battle on the occupied worlds turned in hours as the hunters became the hunted. Jake led his fighters in a coordinated assault on the main Kethvar command post in what had been New Seattle's government district. The alien officers inside were trying desperately to contact their superiors, not knowing that most of the Dominion's military leadership had died when their homeworlds were cracked open like nuts. The resistance fighters showed no mercy, too. The creatures who had tortured human civilians and destroyed entire cities. Admiral Lisa Carter's conventional fleet struck the Kethvar forces that had been drawn away from their home systems by months of carefully planned battles. The enemy. Ships were caught completely off guard by the scale and coordination of the human attack. While they had been chasing Lisa's forces through the outer colonies, their entire civilization was being systematically erased by weapons they had never imagined possible. The Kethvar fleet formations that had seemed so powerful during their initial attacks now looked pitifully inadequate compared to the forces that Earth had kept hidden for centuries. Human ships emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, their weapons systems calibrated to exploit every weakness that resistance fighters had identified in alien technology. Lisa's flagship struck the Kethvar command vessel with a concentrated barrage that turned the massive alien ship into expanding debris in seconds. Her tactical officers coordinated attacks on enemy formations with ruthless efficiency, ensuring that no Kethvar vessel escaped to carry word of humanity's true military capabilities to other species. Captain Alex Harrison watched from the bridge of the Nemesis as the final phase of the operation began. Dr. Nina Walsh's most terrible creations, the Extinction Protocol devices, activated in 17 Kethvar star systems simultaneously. These weapons went beyond mere planetary destruction, creating gravitational anomalies that would sterilize entire regions of space over the coming years. The effects started slowly, with subtle changes in local gravity fields that pulled asteroids and comets out of their normal orbits. But the process accelerated quickly as the weapons created cascade failures in the fundamental structure of space-time itself. Stars began to flicker and dim as their fusion processes became unstable. Planets drifted away from their suns as gravitational constants shifted beyond the range that could support stable solar systems. Within 72 hours, the Kethvar Dominion ceased to exist. Their species was extinct, their worlds uninhabitable, and their empire erased from the galaxy as thoroughly as if it had never been. The few alien ships that had been operating far from Dominion space when the attack began carried the only surviving members of a race that had controlled 40 star systems just days earlier. Dr. Nina Walsh monitored the Extinction Protocol's deployment from her laboratory on Ceres, watching as sensor readings confirmed the complete sterilization of target systems. The weapons were performing exactly as designed, creating dead zones where matter could not exist in stable forms. These regions of space would serve as permanent monuments to what happened when someone threatened human children. Nina felt the weight of what she had accomplished. In 3 days, she had overseen the destruction of an entire species and rendered 17 star systems uninhabitable for millions of years. The weapons she had created would be remembered as the most terrible instruments of war ever deployed. But they had served their purpose. No other species would make the mistake of attacking human worlds after witnessing the Kethvar's fate. President Helen Brooks addressed the galaxy from the Oval Office as reports of the campaign's success reached Earth. Her words were broadcast to every known alien civilization, carried by quantum communication networks that reached across hundreds of light years. The message was simple and direct, spoken in a voice that carried the absolute certainty of someone who had just demonstrated humanity's ultimate capabilities. Helen looked directly into the camera as she spoke about the consequences of attacking human worlds. The Kethvar had chosen to test humanity's resolve, and they had learned what happened when a patient species was finally pushed beyond its limits. Any other race that threatened human colonies would face the same fate that had befallen the Dominion. The president's speech was heard in alien capitals throughout known space, where government leaders watched the destruction of HFY worlds with growing horror and respect. The quiet species from Sol's system had revealed capabilities that dwarfed anything other races had imagined possible. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted permanently in favor of a civilization that preferred trade to conquest, but possessed the means to end entire species when threatened. The few surviving HFY ships fled to the galaxy's edge, carrying tales of humanity's terrible retaliation to anyone who would listen. Their stories described weapons that could crack planets and sterilize star systems, deployed by a species that had hidden its true nature until the moment came to strike. The survivors served as living warnings to other races about the dangers of underestimating Earth's children. General Carl Murphy stood in his command center beneath the Rocky Mountains, watching status reports confirm the complete success of humanity's final retaliation. Every target had been destroyed, every objective achieved, and every threat to human space eliminated. The weapons that had been built in secret for over 2 centuries had performed flawlessly, proving that patience and preparation could overcome any enemy. The general knew that the galaxy would never be the same. Other alien species would approach humanity with newfound respect, understanding that the peaceful traders and explorers from Earth possessed the power to end civilizations that threatened them. The age of human expansion would continue, but it would do so under the Jake Morrison crouched in the ruins of what had been New Seattle's Central Library, watching HFY patrol ships move across the blackened sky. 3 months had passed since the bombardment, and the alien occupation forces had settled into a routine that Jake was learning to exploit. The resistance movement on New Seattle was small but growing as survivors emerged from deep shelters and underground tunnels to strike back at their conquerors. The human survivors had learned to move through the destroyed cities like ghosts, using rubble and wreckage to hide from alien sensors. Jake's group had salvaged weapons and equipment from destroyed defense installations, turning mining charges and industrial tools into improvised weapons. They couldn't fight the HFY in open battle, but they could make the occupation costly and dangerous. Jake's most valuable assets were the intelligence reports he gathered about HFY deployments and tactics. Every patrol route was mapped, every guard post identified, and every weakness in the alien security network cataloged and transmitted to resistance cells on other occupied worlds. The information was sent through hidden communication networks that had been built years earlier for emergency coordination between colonies. The resistance fighters were not professional soldiers, but they understood their homeworld better than any alien invader ever could. They knew which tunnels connected to which buildings, which power conduits could be sabotaged without affecting human shelters, and which supply routes the HFY used to move equipment between their bases. Captain Alex Harrison stood in the weapons bay of the experimental ship Nemesis, watching technicians install the first production model Hellfire device. The weapon looked deceptively simple. A black cylinder no larger than a conventional torpedo, but Alex knew it contained enough destructive power to crack a planet in half. His ship was the first of 12 vessels designed specifically to carry these ultimate weapons into battle. The Retribution fleet existed in facilities so secret that most humans didn't know they were there. Hidden shipyards in the outer solar system had been building these vessels for over a century, using technology that pushed human engineering far beyond anything the colonies had ever seen. Each ship was a work of art designed for a single terrible purpose, the complete annihilation of enemy worlds. Alex's crew consisted entirely of volunteers who had personal reasons for wanting to serve on the mission. His weapons officer had lost, her parents on Haven's Rest. His navigation specialist had been scheduled to transfer to Kepler's Garden the week before it was attacked. Every person aboard the Nemesis carried memories of friends and family who had died in the alien bombardments. The training exercises for the Retribution fleet took place in the asteroid belt, far from inhabited worlds where the tests might be observed. Alex watched his crew practice targeting procedures on asteroids that had been designated as enemy worlds. The first field test of a Hellfire weapon was a moment that would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it. The target asteroid was approximately the same size as a small moon, composed of rock and metal similar to a planetary core. The Hellfire device detonated deep within its structure, creating a cascade reaction that spread through the entire mass in seconds. The asteroid didn't just explode, it came apart at the molecular level, leaving only superheated plasma where solid matter had existed moments before. HFY scouts stationed at the edge of human space detected the energy signature of the test and transmitted reports back to their commanders. But the aliens had no frame of reference for understanding what they had observed. The weapon's effects looked like a natural stellar phenomenon rather than artificial technology, and Dominion scientists dismissed the readings as solar interference or equipment malfunction. Dr. Nina Walsh completed the final calculations for humanity's most terrible creation deep in her laboratory beneath the surface of Ceres. The Extinction Protocol represented the ultimate expression of human warfare, weapons that could sterilize entire star systems and ensure nothing would ever live in them again. These were not devices designed to win battles or capture territory, but instruments of absolute revenge that would serve as permanent warnings to anyone who might threaten human worlds. The technology behind the Extinction Protocol pushed physics to its absolute limits. Each device created a controlled collapse in local space-time, generating gravitational anomalies that would tear apart planets, moons, and even the star itself. The effects would spread throughout the target system over several years, leaving behind a region of space where matter could not exist in stable forms. Nina understood the moral weight of what she was creating. These weapons would be used to commit genocide on a scale that had never been seen in galactic history. Entire species would be wiped out, their homeworlds reduced to clouds of elementary particles drifting in the void. But when she remembered the footage of human children being tortured by HFY soldiers, she knew there was no choice but to complete the work. General Carl Murphy coordinated resistance operations across all occupied human worlds from his command center beneath Earth's surface. The communication networks that connected the various resistance cells had been built decades earlier as part of humanity's emergency preparedness protocols, but they were now being used for their intended purpose for the first time. The Resistance. Fighters provided crucial intelligence about HFY military deployments and tactical preferences. Their reports revealed that the aliens were overconfident in their occupation duties, relying on superior technology rather than proper security protocols. This information would be vital when Earth's counterattack finally began, allowing human forces to strike at the most vulnerable points in enemy formations. Carl also coordinated the distribution of weapons and equipment to resistance cells through supply networks that had been hidden throughout human space. Civilian transport ships carried military hardware disguised as industrial equipment, while maintenance workers installed weapon caches in locations that appeared to be routine infrastructure projects. Admiral Lisa Carter's conventional fleet engaged Kethvar forces in a series of running battles throughout the outer colonies, drawing alien attention away from Earth while the Retribution fleet completed its preparations. Her ships were outgunned and outnumbered, but they fought with desperate courage that surprised their enemies and bought precious time for humanity's ultimate weapons to deploy. Lisa's strategy required her to sacrifice ships and crews to maintain the illusion that Earth's counterattack would rely on conventional military forces. Each battle was carefully planned to inflict maximum damage on enemy formations while concealing the true extent of human military capabilities. The Kethvar needed to believe they were facing a desperate but hopeless resistance rather than the preliminary phase of a carefully orchestrated campaign of extermination. The Admiral's forces also served as bait, drawing Kethvar reinforcements away from their home systems and toward the human colonies where they could be more easily targeted by the incoming Retribution fleet. Every alien ship that responded to Lisa's attacks was one less defender protecting the Dominion's core worlds when Earth's ultimate retaliation finally began. War Prime. Thekshan studied battle reports from the ongoing campaign against human resistance forces and felt confident that victory was within reach. The human counterattacks were fierce but uncoordinated, relying on outdated technology and desperate tactics that achieved little more than delaying the inevitable. Within 6 months, all human colonies would be under complete Dominion control, and the troublesome species from Sol's system would be reduced to slaves or eliminated entirely. The War Prime's intelligence reports indicated that Earth was preparing some kind of major military response, but the scale appeared manageable. Human shipyards were producing new vessels, but they looked like enlarged versions of existing designs rather than revolutionary technology. Weapons testing in the outer solar system showed energy signatures consistent with improved versions of known human armaments. Thekshan prepared defensive strategies based on the assumption that humanity's counterattack would rely on conventional military tactics. Additional fleet formations were positioned to defend key Dominion worlds, while ground forces were reinforced on the occupied human colonies. The War Prime expected a desperate assault that would be easily repelled by superior Kethvar forces, but the Dominion's greatest weakness was their inability to understand human psychology. Kethvar culture valued immediate action and overwhelming force, making it impossible for them to comprehend a species that would spend centuries preparing for a single decisive strike. The idea that humans might hide their true military capabilities for generations was so alien to Kethvar, thinking that they literally could not process the possibility. Pete Collins had died defending Haven's Rest, but his sacrifice had inspired a resistance movement that now controlled large sections of the mining complex. The surviving miners used their knowledge of the tunnel networks to launch surprise attacks on Kethvar positions, then disappear into passages too narrow for alien soldiers to follow. The resistance on Haven's Rest was particularly effective, because the miners understood explosives better than any other group of humans. They used shaped charges and controlled demolitions. The footage from New Seattle reached Earth exactly 6 hours and 23 minutes after the first Kethvar ship appeared in that system. President Helen Brooks was in a cabinet meeting discussing agricultural subsidies when her chief of staff burst into the room with a tablet showing images that would change everything. Helen watched the recordings in stunned silence. Cities she had visited during campaign tours were now fields of molten glass. Schools where human children had learned and played were craters filled with radioactive ash. The wheat fields that fed 3-star systems burned under alien bombardment, sending columns of black smoke into a sky filled with enemy warships. The president dismissed her cabinet and walked alone to the Oval Office. She stood behind her desk for a long moment, looking out the window at the peaceful gardens where tourists took pictures and children fed ducks in the pond. In a few hours, she would have to tell the human race that their expansion into the galaxy had triggered a war that might destroy their species. But first, Helen Brooks made a phone call that had not been necessary for over 200 years. Deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, in bunkers that most humans had forgotten existed, General Carl Murphy answered a secure line that connected directly to the president's desk. The conversation was brief and used code words that dated back to the earliest days of human space exploration. Carl Murphy had been waiting for this call his entire career. As commander of Terra Defense Command, he was responsible for weapons and strategies that were so terrible that previous presidents had hoped they would never be needed. But the founders of human space colonization had been realistic about the dangers their species might face among the stars. Within minutes of receiving the president's authorization, Carl activated protocols that brought systems online across the solar system. Hidden facilities in the asteroid belt began producing materials that had been stockpiled for centuries. Weapons factories that appeared to be civilian manufacturing plants suddenly shifted to military production. The peaceful face that humanity showed to the galaxy was about to come off. Dr. Nina Walsh was in her laboratory on Ceres when the activation order reached her. As head of the Terran Weapons Division, she had spent 20 years designing instruments of war that she hoped would never be used. Her research team had been working on theoretical projects that pushed the boundaries of physics itself, creating weapons that could destroy not just ships or planets, but entire star systems. The Hellfire-class planet crackers had existed only as blueprints and computer simulations for over a century. They were weapons designed with a single purpose in mind, the complete annihilation of enemy worlds. Each Hellfire device contained technology that could destabilize a planet's core, turning worlds into expanding clouds of superheated gas and molten metal. Nina's team had 6 months to turn theory into reality. The weapons required exotic materials that could only be produced in zero-gravity environments using manufacturing techniques that pushed human engineering to its absolute limits. But the resources of an entire solar system were now dedicated to the task, and Nina had access to facilities that civilian scientists didn't even know existed. Captain Alex Harrison was enjoying shore leave on Luna when the recall order arrived. He had been planning to visit his family on Mars, but instead found himself reporting to a briefing room filled with officers he had never seen before. The man who addressed them wore no insignia of rank, but everyone in the room understood they were in the presence of someone very important. The briefing was unlike anything Alex had experienced during his 15 years in the human fleet. The officers learned about weapons programs that had been classified above their security levels, ship designs that existed only in secret shipyards, and military strategies that assumed humanity would eventually face enemies who wanted to wipe them out completely. Alex volunteered for the new assignment without hesitation. His parents had died in a transport accident when he was young, but his sister lived on New Seattle with her husband and 2 children. The footage from that world showed buildings he recognized, streets where his niece and nephew had played, parks where his family had gathered for holidays. All of it was gone now, along with everyone he had cared about. The Retribution fleet was assembled from volunteers across human space. Every officer and crew member had personal reasons for wanting to serve, and most of them had lost family or friends in the Kethvar attacks. They trained with equipment that made their previous assignments look like children's toys, learning to operate weapons that could crack moons and vaporize asteroids. Admiral Lisa Carter received new orders that changed her entire understanding of humanity's place in the galaxy. The fleet she had been commanding was revealed to be only the visible portion of human military strength. Hidden bases throughout the solar system contained ships and weapons that dwarfed anything the colonies had ever seen. Lisa's new assignment was to buy time for Earth's ultimate weapons to deploy. Her conventional forces would engage the Kethvar fleets still operating in human space, drawing their attention away from the solar system while the Retribution fleet prepared for launch. It was a dangerous mission that would require her to sacrifice ships and crews to maintain the deception. The Admiral understood the stakes involved. If the Kethvar learned about Earth's hidden military capabilities too soon, they might launch a preemptive strike against the human homeworld. But if Lisa could keep them focused on the outer colonies for just a few more months, humanity would have time to deploy weapons that could end the war with a single devastating counterstrike. President Brooks addressed the human species from the Oval Office 18 hours after the first attack reports arrived. Her speech was broadcast to every human world and transmitted to alien governments throughout known space. The words were carefully chosen to convey strength without revealing the true extent of humanity's hidden capabilities. Helen looked directly into the camera as she spoke about humanity's response to unprovoked aggression. She promised that the Kethvar would face consequences for their attacks, but she did not specify what those consequences would be. The aliens had chosen to test human resolve, and they would learn what happened when a patient species was finally pushed beyond its limits. The president's speech was heard in the deepest bunkers beneath Earth's surface, where engineers worked around the clock to complete weapons that existed beyond normal human understanding. The Extinction Protocol represented the ultimate expression of human warfare. Devices that could sterilize entire star systems and ensure that nothing could ever live in them again. These were not weapons designed to win territory or capture resources. They were instruments of absolute vengeance, created by a species that had learned the hard way that some enemies could not be reasoned with or defeated through conventional means. The Kethvar had chosen to make war on human children, and they would face the full fury of a species that protected its young above all else. War Prime. Thekshan received reports of increased human military activity throughout their home system. His intelligence agents reported new ship construction and weapon testing, but the scale seemed insignificant compared to the Dominion's military strength. Humans appeared to be preparing for a conventional counterattack that would be easily crushed by superior Kethvar forces. The War Prime had been expecting some kind of human response to his attacks. No species would accept the destruction of their colonies without attempting revenge, even if that revenge was doomed to failure. Thekshan prepared to defend the newly conquered human worlds and planned additional strikes against targets deeper in human space. But the Kethvar intelligence reports contained a fatal flaw. Their agents could observe human military preparations, but they could not understand the true nature of what they were seeing. The ships being built in Earth's orbital yards looked like enlarged versions of existing human designs, and the weapon tests appeared to be incremental improvements of known technology. Thekshan's greatest mistake was assuming that humans thought like his own people. Kethvar military doctrine emphasized immediate retaliation and overwhelming force applied as quickly as possible. The idea that a species might spend centuries preparing for a war that might never come was incomprehensible to minds that valued quick, decisive action above long-term planning. General Carl Murphy coordinated the largest military buildup in human history from his command post beneath Cheyenne Mountain. Facilities that had been dormant for decades came online, producing materials and components that existed nowhere else in known space. The industrial capacity of an entire solar system focused on a single goal: the complete destruction of humanity's enemies. The general had been planning for this moment since he was a young lieutenant assigned to theoretical warfare studies. He understood that humans were not the strongest or most advanced species in the galaxy, but they had advantages that their enemies consistently underestimated: patience, long-term thinking, and the ability to hide their true capabilities until the moment came to strike. Dr. Nina Walsh watched the first Hellfire prototype complete its initial testing phase. The weapon was smaller than she had expected, no larger than a conventional torpedo, but its destructive potential. The first sign of trouble was when every sensor on Defense Station Alpha started screaming warnings at once. Jake Morrison jumped up from his desk as alarm bells rang throughout the command center. His coffee mug hit the floor and shattered, but he barely noticed as he rushed to the main tactical display. What he saw there made his blood turn cold. Dozens of massive ships were dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the new Seattle system. They were unlike anything in human databases, with dark hulls covered in weapon ports and armor plating. The ships moved in perfect formation toward the planet, and their energy readings showed power levels that dwarfed anything humans had ever built. Jake slammed his hand on the emergency communications panel. His voice echoed through every speaker on New Seattle as he activated the colony-wide alert system. Citizens needed to reach emergency shelters immediately. This was not a drill, and everyone had less than an hour before those alien ships reached orbit. The defense platforms around New Seattle came online automatically, their targeting systems locking onto the approaching fleet. Jake knew the platforms were designed to handle pirates and raiders, not military formations of this size. The human weapons looked like toys compared to the massive gun barrels he could see on the alien warships. In the capital city of New Olympia, people looked up at the sky as sirens wailed through the streets. Most citizens had never heard the emergency alert system used for anything more serious than severe weather warnings. Parents grabbed their children and ran for the underground shelters that had been built decades earlier, but never used. Traffic jammed the roads as 12 million people tried to find safety all at once. Jake coordinated the defense from his command center as the first Kethvar ships entered weapons range. The alien vessels were enormous, some of them over 2 kilometers long and bristling with enough firepower to level continents. Their formations moved with military precision that spoke of centuries of warfare experience. The human defense platforms opened fire first, sending streams of plasma bolts and missile volleys toward the advancing fleet. For a few seconds, Jake allowed himself to hope that the defenses might hold. Some of the human weapons found their targets, and he saw explosions bloom against alien hulls. But the Kethvar return fire was devastating beyond anything Jake had imagined. Beams of pure energy lanced down from the alien ships, striking the defense platforms with such force that they simply vaporized. In less than 10 minutes, every orbital weapon around New Seattle was reduced to glowing debris. Then the bombardment of the planet began. Jake watched in horror as the first plasma bolts struck New Olympia. The alien weapons were designed to crack fortified positions, and they turned entire city blocks into molten glass in seconds. Buildings that had stood for decades disappeared in flashes of superheated gas. The emergency shelters that were supposed to protect civilians proved useless against weapons designed for planetary assault. Across New Seattle, the same scene played out in every major population center. Cities that had taken 50 years to build were being erased in minutes. Jake tried to coordinate evacuation efforts, but his communications networks were being systematically destroyed by the alien attack. One by one, his contact with other defense installations went silent. On Haven's Rest, Pete Collins was having the worst morning of his life. The mining colony's sensors had picked up the hyperspace signatures just minutes before Kethvar ships appeared in local space. Pete had maybe 20 minutes to get 2 million people into the deep mine shafts before the bombardment started. The miners knew their tunnels better than anyone, and they moved fast when Pete announced the emergency. Over the colony's communication system, families poured into elevator shafts that dropped hundreds of meters into the planet's crust. The deepest mining levels might provide some protection from orbital bombardment, assuming the aliens didn't use weapons powerful enough to crack the planet's core. Pete stayed at his command post until the last moment, coordinating the evacuation and trying to send warnings to other human colonies. His final transmission included sensor recordings of the Kethvar fleet, hoping that someone might learn something useful from the data before it was too late. The alien ships above Haven's Rest were different from the fleet attacking New Seattle. These vessels carried ground assault troops instead of just orbital bombardment weapons. Pete realized with growing dread that the Kethvar intended to occupy his world rather than simply destroy it. Landing craft began dropping from the alien ships, heading for the main mining complex. Pete could see them through his office window as they descended on pillars of fire, carrying soldiers whose species had never been defeated in battle. He grabbed his sidearm and prepared to sell his life as dearly as possible. The Kethvar ground forces that emerged from the landing craft were nightmarish creatures bred for war. They stood 3 meters tall with natural armor plating and razor-sharp claws that could tear through human battlesuits. Their weapons looked like they had been designed by someone who enjoyed causing pain as much as destruction. Pete's mining equipment became improvised weapons as humans tried desperately to defend their homes. Industrial laser cutters and explosive charges used for tunnel excavation turned into military hardware in the hands of desperate miners. But human workers were no match for alien warriors who had been conquering worlds for centuries. The battle for Haven's Rest lasted 6 hours. Pete Collins died leading a charge to retake the main communications array, hoping to warn other colonies about Kethvar ground tactics. His sacrifice bought enough time for a few transport ships to escape with civilian refugees, carrying word of the massacre to the broader human community. Dr. Amy Rodriguez was the chief scientist on Kepler's Garden, a research station orbiting a gas giant in the outer system. Her facility studied exotic physics and developed new technologies that benefited all human colonies. The work was peaceful and productive, contributing to humanity's growing understanding of the universe. When the Kethvar fleet arrived at Kepler's Garden, Amy was conducting an experiment on gravitational wave detection. The sudden appearance of alien warships at the edge of the system interrupted her work in the most violent way possible. The research station had no military defenses, since it posed no threat to anyone. The Kethvar approach to the research station was different from their tactics at the colony worlds. Instead of immediate bombardment, they captured the facility intact and took the human researchers prisoner. Amy found herself face to face with creatures that looked like they had stepped out of humanity's worst nightmares. What happened next would haunt human space for generations. The Kethvar didn't just kill their prisoners quickly. They tortured the scientists slowly and methodically, broadcasting the executions across human communication networks as a warning to other colonies. The aliens wanted humans to understand exactly what would happen to anyone who resisted the Dominion. Amy Rodriguez died knowing that her sacrifice would not be forgotten. Her final transmission, sent while Kethvar soldiers prepared their torture devices, included research data that would prove crucial to humanity's eventual response. She had discovered something important about alien technology during her brief captivity, and she made sure that information reached human space before the end came. Captain Roy Stevens commanded the destroyer Valiant, one of 3 human warships patrolling the outer colonies when the attacks began. His ship received distress calls from all 3 target systems simultaneously, and Roy made the hardest decision of his military career. He could only respond to one emergency, and he chose New Seattle because it had the largest civilian population. T. Valiant dropped out of hyperspace to find New Seattle's orbital defenses already destroyed and the planet under heavy bombardment. Roy's ship was designed for patrol duties and anti-pirate operations, not fleet combat against military formations. But he had to try something, even if it meant certain death for his crew. The destroyer's attack run against the Kethvar fleet was brave but hopeless. The Valiant's weapons barely scratched the alien ship's armor, while their return fire nearly vaporized Roy's vessel in a single volley. Only desperate maneuvering and a lucky hit on one alien ship's sensor array allowed the Valiant to escape destruction. Roy managed to rescue a few thousand civilians from the burning cities below, cramming refugees into every available space aboard his ship. The destroyer limped back toward human space with hull breaches and failing life support, carrying survivors who had witnessed the end of their world. The journey back to Luna Station took 4 days, and Roy used every hour to compile intelligence, reports about Kethvar weapons and tactics. His crew interviewed refugees and analyzed sensor recordings, trying to understand how the aliens had achieved such devastating success in so little time. When the Valiant finally docked at Luna Station, Roy Stevens delivered the worst news in human history. 3 colonies were gone, their populations dead or enslaved, and their worlds now under alien occupation. The survivors he carried were the only witnesses to what had happened when humanity's enemies finally decided to strike. Admiral Lisa Carter received Roy's reports with growing horror and rage. The Kethvar had not just attacked human worlds. The morning sun rose over New Seattle, just like it had for the past 50 years since humans first built their colony on this distant world. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of Defense Station Alpha, watching the golden light spread across the vast wheat fields that stretched to the horizon. The farms on New Seattle fed 3 neighboring star systems, and the sight of those endless crops always made Jake feel proud of what humans had built out here in the darkness between stars. Jake sipped his coffee and checked the daily reports on his tablet. Everything looked normal. The defense grid showed green lights across all sectors. The orbital platforms hummed quietly above the planet, their sensors scanning empty space for threats that never came. Trade ships moved peacefully between the colonies, carrying grain and manufactured goods to worlds that had become humanity's new homes among the stars. It was the year 2387, and life was good for the 17 human colonies scattered across known space. Children grew up on worlds their grandparents could never have imagined, playing in alien sunlight under foreign skies. Scientists studied new forms of life, while farmers grew earth crops in alien soil. Engineers built cities that rose like silver, towers from landscapes that had never known intelligent life before humans arrived. Jake had been born on New Seattle 32 years ago, back when the colony was just a few prefab buildings and a landing strip. He had watched his world grow from a frontier outpost into a thriving planet of 12 million souls. The defense job was mostly routine work, monitoring sensors and filing reports that no one ever read because nothing dangerous had ever threatened the human colonies. But Jake knew that beyond human space, other species watched and waited. The HFY Dominion controlled 40 star systems, and their ships sometimes appeared at the edge of human territory. They never attacked, but they never responded to human attempts at communication either. Jake had seen the intelligence reports about HFY society, and what he read made him uneasy. The HFY had evolved from pack hunters on a harsh world where only the strongest survived. Their entire culture was built around the idea that might made right, and they had conquered every other species on their home planet before reaching for the stars. When they met other alien races during their expansion, they either enslaved them or wiped them out completely. There was no middle ground in HFY thinking. Admiral Lisa Carter understood this better than most humans. She commanded the human fleet from Luna Station, orbiting Earth's moon, and she had been trying to establish diplomatic contact with the Dominion for over a decade. Her messages were polite and carefully worded, offering trade agreements and cultural exchanges, but the HFY never replied. Their ships appeared at human borders, observed for a few days, then vanished back into their own territory. Lisa's reports to the Unified Defense Council on Earth grew more worried each month. HFY patrol fleets were getting larger and staying longer near human space. Their formations looked more military and less like exploration missions. Intelligence suggested they were building new shipyards and weapons factories in systems close to human colonies. But the politicians on Earth believed that patience and diplomacy would eventually work. The Defense Council was made up of representatives from all 17 human worlds, and most of them had never seen real combat. They had grown up during the peaceful expansion period when humanity's biggest challenges were crop failures and equipment breakdowns. The idea of interstellar war seemed impossible to them. Humans were traders and explorers, not conquerors like the HFY. On the remote mining world of Haven's Rest, colony administrator Pete Collins spent his days managing ore extraction and shipping schedules. Haven's Rest was a small world with only 2 million inhabitants, most of them miners and their families. The planet was rich in rare metals that other colonies needed for their industries, so the work was important even though life was hard in the deep mines. Pete had been running the colony for 8 years, and he knew every piece of equipment and every tunnel in the mining complex. His people trusted him to keep them safe while they dug precious metals from the planet's crust. The work was dangerous enough without worrying about outside threats, so Pete tried to keep his concerns about border security to himself. But lately, Pete had been noticing strange readings on the system's long-range sensors. Energy signatures appeared at the edge of the solar system for a few hours, then disappeared. The signals were too weak and too brief to identify, but they happened with increasing frequency. Pete sent reports to the Colonial Fleet headquarters, but the response was always the same. Solar interference was common in systems with active mining operations, and there was no cause for alarm. Pete wanted to believe that explanation, but something felt wrong. He had been monitoring space around Haven's Rest for years, and these new signals were different from normal solar activity. They appeared in patterns that looked almost like ship formations, but that seemed impossible. No one had any reason to spy on a mining colony in the middle of nowhere, 3,000 light-years away in the heart of Kethvar space, War Prime. Thekshan studied holographic displays showing human colony locations. The War Prime was the supreme military commander of the Dominion, answering only to the Emperor himself. Thekshan had led successful campaigns against 6 different alien species, and he understood warfare better than any other Kethvar alive. To Thekshan, humans looked impossibly weak. They built their colonies without serious military defenses, relying on patrol ships that could barely fight off pirates. Human society seemed built around cooperation instead of competition, which made no sense to a species that had fought for every scrap of territory they controlled. The humans even tried to communicate with their enemies instead of attacking first, which was the most incomprehensible behavior Thekshan had ever observed. The War Prime had been planning his campaign against human space for 2 years. His scouts had mapped every human colony and defense installation, and the intelligence reports confirmed his initial assessment. Humans had spread themselves thin across 17 systems, with most of their military forces concentrated around Earth. The outer colonies were defended by nothing more than a few patrol boats and orbital sensor platforms. In Kethvar military doctrine, the first strike had to be overwhelming and brutal. The enemy needed to understand immediately that resistance was hopeless and that surrender was their only option for survival. Thekshan had chosen his targets carefully: New Seattle, Haven's Rest, and the research station orbiting Kepler's. Garden were the most vulnerable human settlements, far from Earth's protection and lightly defended. The attack fleets were already assembled in staging areas along the border. Thekshan's ships carried enough firepower to crack planets, and his ground forces were trained to break any resistance quickly and efficiently. The humans would learn what happened when a weak species tried to expand into territory that belonged to their betters. Jake Morrison finished his coffee and prepared for another quiet day of routine patrols. He had no idea that Kethvar battle fleets were already moving through hyperspace toward his world, or that his peaceful morning would be remembered as the last day of innocence for the human race.